Hello, thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome you to this month's Beyond the Writing Academy virtual event, Suspense, Not Just for Mysteries and Thrillers. This panel is sponsored by Bywater Books.
Remember the first time you saw yourself in a story? Someone who looked like you. Someone who sounded like you. Someone who hurt like you and dreamed like you. Someone who loved like you. Stories are powerful. They allow us to explore different worlds and to imagine better endings. They teach us to remember, and they illuminate a way forward. They offer comfort in sadness and hope for tomorrow. They show us that we are valued, that we are never alone, that we belong. Stories enrich our lives. Bywater Books and Amble Press. We are all stories.
Thanks again to Bywater Books for sponsoring this panel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel today. I'm Rita Potter, and I'll be your moderator today. And I'm just going to jump right in, let you know who we're talking to. And we want to thank you for being here today on what's hopefully a beautiful August day, whether it's day, morning, evening, wherever you're at. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our panelists, and then we'll jump into some questions. First off, we have Elle, Goldie winner. Elle writes sapphic, paranormal, and science fiction featuring fast-paced action, emotional upheaval, and plenty of romantic tension. In her real life, she's a middle school teacher, surrounded daily by hormonal adolescents. So pretty much like the same thing. Elle enjoys taking weapons lessons and singing karaoke in dive bars. She's represented by her agent, Naomi Davis, at Bookends. There's a bunch of questions in there, but I'll leave them for later. So next up is MB Austin. MB writes stories about badass women in love and danger. The Maji Rios series and forthcoming Blur's Days Revenge. She lives with her fabulous wife in Seattle, an excellent town for coffee, fueled riders who don't need too much sun. Next up, we've got Meredith Doench. Meredith is the author of the Luce Hansen thriller series and the 2022 standalone thriller Whereabouts Unknown. An avid armchair detective and pizza addict, Meredith loves all things mystery. She is a board member of Mystery Writers of America, Midwest chapter, and a principal lecturer of creative writing and literature at the University of Dayton in Ohio. Next up, we have Riley Scott. In addition to having published poetry and short stories, Riley has worked as a grant and press writer and a marketing professional. Riley's love for fiction began at a young age, and she has been penning stories for over a decade. I don't think she looks that old, but that's all right. She has 6 standalone novels published by Bella Books. She lives in Pensacola, Florida, with the love of her life and their 3 beloved dogs. And last but certainly not least, we have Virginia Black. Virginia loves whiskey, loud music, and writing dark speculative, I can never say that word. You know what I'm talking about. Speculative fiction. Author of Consecrated Ground, her debut paranormal romance from Bywater Books, an upcoming science fiction release, No Shelter But the Stars. Virginia lives in the Pacific Northwest with her wife and their savagely witty daughter. And those are our panelists for today. And I'm just going to jump right in. And we're obviously talking about suspense today. And I want just a brief thing from everyone on what does that word mean to you? Elle, I'll start with you.
Well, I think a lot of people associate suspense with murder and catching the killer and that sort of thing. And it absolutely is that. But I think it's also the tension that pulls the reader through the story, and any kind of story, whether it's romantic tension or tension built from a science fiction setting, whatever it might be. So that's how I view suspense.
What about you, MB?
I think there is suspense in a story anytime that the reader is emotionally invested in the characters and has uncertainty about what's going to happen to them, whether it's a good thing that the characters want, whether they're going to get it, or whether it's some bad thing waiting to get them and whether it's going to do that. And so that combination of really them caring and there being uncertainty about the outcome, that's suspense.
Okay. Virginia, what do you have to add?
Suspense is an increasing anxiety about the resolution of unanswered questions over the length of a work. The reader doesn't know what's going to happen and is increasingly interested in finding out.
Great. Meredith?
Yeah, mine kind of builds on Virginia's. I always think of the word engagement when I think of suspense, and that I want to be engaged myself as the writer, or otherwise the reader is definitely not going to be engaged. But I also want them collecting the clues along the way and engaged in that with me as well, too.
And Riley?
I think I echo what MB says about that connection. It's all about having that connection with the characters, with the story, and that curiosity. It's liking those characters enough to want to know what's going to happen next? How are they going to get through this? It's that curiosity and those unanswered questions that drives your reader through the pages.
Okay, great answers. Now we're going to talk, as most of you can see, we've got a variety of different authors. We don't have all suspense authors here. So we're going to talk about how suspense crosses a lot of different genres. And we're going to start with the two, MB and Meredith, who write a little closer to suspense than maybe the rest of the panel. And I'm going to ask you, how do you keep your suspense fresh? Since you do write in a suspenseful genre already, how do you keep it fresh? I'll start with Meredith.
Yeah, I would classify what I write more as like crime fiction or detective fiction. Everything that I've written has been that way. And so it's really hard to keep it fresh because it's got a similar kind of a structure that it builds on. And so I think that what works best, and this is what I'm struggling with so much right now, is creating some sort of a surprise. And the surprise is what I think really hooks the reader in and then keeps them like, oh, I didn't see that. I didn't see that coming, or I missed it. And then that pulls them through. But in order for that to happen, most of the time it has to surprise me. And so it's this double thing that kind of happens along the way.
So the reader can't possibly see it coming because you didn't even know it was coming.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about you, MB? How do you keep it fresh?
Pretty similar. I know what the overall story is about and what the big conflict is, but then there needs to be lots of little surprises about, oh, that's going on. Oh no. Those moments like, oh shit, it's getting worse. I didn't see that coming. And I think it helps if in a longer work, the readers think there's one main thing, but then as they go along, oh, it's really about that. Oh, there's that. Oh my God, it's a bigger thing than I thought it was. So again, yeah, the unexpected, but not illogical, not out of left field. Just, oh, of course, that makes it much worse.
Yes. Okay, now we're going to move on to our speculative, which I can't say, which we already determined, our spec fiction writers. And that would be Virginia and Elle. How do you use it? Do you use it just in general, or do you use it as part of your world building? Virginia, I'll start with you.
I think all good stories have some element of suspense, right? And the best ones have stakes that are so intense you're not sure that they're going to be resolved or that the protagonist is even going to be successful. And there are these grades of suspense, right? What's the adage? To build a story, you take your protagonist and you put them in a tree. And perhaps one end of the spectrum is try to get them down from a 30-foot tree. And the other end of the spectrum is make the tree 150 foot tall and set it on fire. It's a fine art that I think I'm still learning. And I hope my readers will determine that I'm being successful.
Okay. What about you, Elle?
It depends on whether we're talking about my science fiction or we're talking about my paranormal. When I'm doing the paranormal, a lot of times the suspense is derived from what makes this world different from our real everyday world. Usually there's a magical element that I'm going to throw in there that's going to affect all the characters and the outcome of the inciting incident and who did what to whom. And how is that going to affect them emotionally and physically and the world around them as they figure out how to traverse all the issues that a magical element is going to bring to the picture. With science fiction, I get to play with everything to make that suspense and that tension. I get whole worlds that I can create. I get time travel where I can really mess you up by throwing them into a completely different timeline, or interweaving two timelines, or alternating what happened to them in the past and what happened to them in the present, so that I'm actually building that suspense and tension on two different fronts at the same time, which is my favorite thing to do. And it's really hard. And I keep kicking myself every time I make myself do it, but it's a lot of fun.
So just a follow-up question. Which one do you think has more suspense, your sci-fi or your paranormal?
It depends on which book. I think Threadbare was absolutely the most challenging book I have ever written, because it's got two point of views and two timelines that interweave and have to come together at the midpoint of the book, which it didn't when I first wrote it. And I had to back it up and scrap about 30,000 words and go forward again, which was loads of fun. Harsh Reality is a time travel book. So you've got what's going on in the past that affects what's happening in the future, and the poor character has to travel through both. I would say those two. So Harsh Reality is more paranormal, and Threadbare is sci-fi.
Okay. And everybody's noticed that I haven't let Riley speak yet, but now it's Riley's turn. Riley, this might be the hardest thing for you because you're pretty much a YA and a contemporary romance writer. How do you use suspense different than what you've heard here so far?
I think it's not necessarily harder. I think it's just slightly different, as that suspense, that curiosity is part of every story. And for us romance writers, you may not have murder, mayhem, and mystery. You also may, but most of the time you're relying on that tension and that connection between your love interests. And so while the genre calls for a happily ever after or a happy for now, there's still the how are they going to get there? I tend to write a lot of very flawed characters. They have a lot of stuff going on that they're working through in their day-to-day, just like all of us do. So a lot of times there are layers to that suspense. There's are they going to get out of their own way for what's good for them? Are they going to go through that character arc of growth? And if so, how? How are they going to mess up along the way? And how are they going to make that connection either last or not? So I think that it's still inherent in there. And especially romance readers, we all want that tension. We all want to feel a little bit of that confusion that comes with a new relationship. What is the other person thinking? What are they feeling? Am I in this alone? So it's all tied into that tension and connection. And that's the suspense mostly that I find in my own writing.
And that's a really great answer, because I was wondering how you're going to answer, because we all know you have to have a happily ever after. So how are you going to create suspense when everybody knows how it's going to end? But how you get there is really, the journey is probably important than the destination, is what you're really saying here.
Absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, going to ask this question of everyone. Not sure if we got plotter or pantsers. I didn't ask this question beforehand, so I don't know what my mix is here. So I'm going to find out along with the listeners here. I'm assuming it's going to be different. Suspense is going to be handled differently depending on if you're a plotter or pantser. So I'll start with Meredith. Plotter or pantser, and how do you handle it?
Oh, wow. I am definitely a pantser. I have tried so hard to go the other way and spend more time developing these. I even tried using spreadsheets for a while to try to keep track of it just doesn't work for me. But what I usually start with is like a very loose outline. And what I mean very loose, like maybe 5 points or 5 scenes that I really want to hit in the book. And those tend to change along the way, but usually 5 is the number I start with. And then I start to build the in-betweens or the bridges that go between those moments or those scenes. Yeah, the spreadsheets, I just saw a comment pop up. The spreadsheets, they just don't work for me. And I've tried to lean in more towards being more of a plotter. I do think it would save me a lot of time, because one of the things that I tend to do, because I am more of a pantser, is it takes me longer to write. And the other thing that I find myself doing that is problematic for me is I have these 5 points that I want to get to, or these 5 scenes, and I tend to go like back up way too far and tell all of this stuff that happened before the book begins. And then I end up cutting all of those words usually. And so I definitely is not a time saver in any way for me to be a pantser. So I'm leaning into it. I'm leaning into being a plotter.
And that sounds like it's only partially working?
Only partially, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, do I have a more of a plotter here? No, okay, we've got Virginia's looking like she may be a little bit more, so I'm going to go with Virginia.
All right. Which term are we using? Is it planter? Is it
Planter.
Well, I pick a thing. The story seed comes to me, and then I think the most common answer that we keep saying here is it depends. Each of my stories evolves differently, and they develop at their own pace. Once I've got that one scene that is the story seed, as the story begins to build, I know where it starts, I know where it ends, and I know the beats, and that's where the plotting is pretty clear. But then I get some surprises that show up while I'm writing, and that's where the pantsing comes in. A lot of the time, I know what questions I want to introduce to the reader, right, to start that anticipation, if you will. But it varies. For Consecrated Ground, I learned about those questions as I was writing, and there were a couple of zingers that surprised even me. For No Shelter But the Stars, I knew every question that I wanted to introduce and what those answers were before I started.
And then you said that you kept getting surprised how much, like Meredith said, she had to go back and scrap a bunch of work and do all that. How much did it mess up the beginning of your story?
I find it really helpful to not count how many words I have to cut. I know some authors who are absolutely religious about, okay, no matter what I write, I'm going to cut 40% of it. For Consecrated Ground, I had the opposite problem. It started in one POV, and then over the course of the story and working with my dev editor, an alternating POV became increasingly prevalent. That changed the course of the story a bit. It actually expanded it in a very good way, but I don't know how many words were cut from those first few versions, and I don't ever want to know, ever.
Good advice, I think. MB, what about you?
I'm also more in the planter category. I start with a general idea about what's going to happen. I know who my people are. I know what they're doing. I know what they're up against. I know what they're trying to get to. I don't always know how they're going to get there. And that's the part that's really fun for me. And I've found that when I try to outline the whole thing, I'll say, oh yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, they should do this, and then they should do this, and then that should happen. And oh, this would be a good twist. And then I start writing it, and it's not what happens. It's better for me if I just know, like, I know the beginning and I write the beginning. And then I think, oh, I know what needs to happen next. And then I write that section. And so it's more like I can outline a little ways ahead. Some people call that not writing into a dark hallway, but writing into a dimly lit hallway, not completely blind.
And so you're a covert op writer, correct?
Say that again?
You write covert ops?
Yes.
And so you have no idea where your mission's going. You're right there with your characters, what you're saying here.
Yeah, sometimes I need to figure out things like, now that they've loaded that Coast Guard helicopter with this much gold, how far can it actually fly before it tanks into the Baltic Sea?
So you are researching that kind of stuff as you go. Oh, is this logical? Is this illogical?
Right, as I go. And sometimes I hit those problems like, oh, that's not going to work the way I thought it was going to work. It was a good idea, but that's not how I can execute it. So I have to change something up.
What about you, Riley?
I am through and through a pantser. The most plotting I have ever done was on the one that I'm working on now. I created actual Word docs with character profiles. Typically, my writing is very character driven. So I know who my characters are. And I'll usually have like one or two scenes that I know that I want to hit somewhere in the book. But so that kind of unwinding of the character's own suspense and then the love story suspense kind of builds itself out and surprises me. My characters surprise me all the time. Once I'm in the character's mind, they're going to do what they want to do. And I just have to live with that. It always surprises me.
And Elle, what about you?
I'm a planter also. So when I sit down to write any book, there are 5 things that I always know. I know who my 2 main characters are. I know how the story starts. I know that dark moment of the soul, midpoint, anxiety attack moment. I know the ending, and I know what the first sex scene looks like. Those are the 5 things that I know what can I tell you? That's because those are my favorites to write. I love to write sex scenes. Other than that, you're taking notes. Other than that, I know that I'm going to rotate 3 things. I'm going to rotate an action sequence. I'm going to rotate an emotional impact moment, and I'm going to rotate a romance building moment as I get from beginning to dark moment of the soul to sex scene to end. But I don't know what those are going to be. I just know that if I've done one of the three, then I need to get the other two in there between the beginning and the middle. And if I've done something else, I need to get all three in between the middle and the end. But I just rotate them until I hit the end.
Okay.
I don't know what they are.
I'm going to say to listeners, if you guys have any questions, please put it in the Q&A because I will be pulling those in a little bit. So get those questions coming so you don't have to listen to all these questions that I made up, because I'd rather have something more creative than what I can come up with. So keep those questions coming. Going to move on to, there's 3 of you on the panel, I believe, that write series, which I would think creates even more suspense, because are you creating that across books? Are they standalone? Do you keep suspense going, knowing you're saving something for book 2 or book 3 or book 4? So I will start with, let's see, Elle.
Okay, so do I have it for book 2, book 3, book and so forth? Yes, but my 2 series are only 3 books at the moment. I would love to write more in both of those series. Usually the main character has some sort of massive trauma or something she's struggling with that will get moments of reprieve, moments of, okay, I've got a grip on this, I've got a handle on it, but it's going to go all the way from book 1 to book 3 and possibly not be entirely completely resolved, even at the end of book 3. For the Stormfront series, Vic struggles with her humanity, and she is going to always have that. It is her primary trauma. In the Nearly Departed series, Flynn struggles with finding out that she has some magical talent and she doesn't want anything to do with it. And she's always going to have that. No matter what she goes through, she's always going to struggle with how much of this makes me something other than a human being. So yeah, that will happen. The big plot, overarching action thing will resolve at the end of each individual book. But the underlying trauma will continue and the romance will have its trials, even though we know that they love each other. They're going to be put to the test in every book.
Okay. What about you, Meredith?
Yeah, mine works very similarly. The Luz Hansen series also has 3 books in it. And Luz Hansen starts out with having a lot of mental health issues. She's had a lot of trauma in her life too. And that doesn't resolve in just one book. The other issue that I had with the Luz Hansen books too, about how much Luz could change in the course of a book, was that they tend to move really quickly. So I think it's the 2nd book in the series is only a week long. Like the whole book takes place in a week. And the Dead, I think and it might have been a 2-week period. So there's not a lot of time built into the novel for my main character to really make this kind of a huge change or something like that. There can be an epiphany, and that's usually what I try to work with, where there's some sort of understanding that she comes to in the course of the book that gives her like some sort of light into how she could be a different person, or possibly how things could work better for her. So that's what I'm going for. I like to call them like my Law and Order books because there's a criminal case that's at the heart of the book, and she solves that, but then she can't necessarily solve, or she's not able to completely solve her own emotional health stuff. And so that's the thing that carries for her. But I think that by the time we got to the 3rd book, she'd come really far, and I feel good about where she is. And for her, it's a happy place. There is definitely growth when you look at the series altogether. It's just harder, I think, in these shorter books that take place over such a short length of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
And MB, what about you?
I will say that Blur's Day's Revenge, which is still my work in progress, I think it's a standalone amateur sleuth mystery, which will be a first for me to make it completely standalone. And we'll see if I get to the end and decide that there's like unfinished business. And if I do, it'll be the same kind of unfinished business that other folks have talked about. It'll be about the growth arc of the main character. And that's absolutely true in the Maji series. She is a covert operator, and each story has a self-contained mission. So you can read them in whatever order, really, although you'll know if you read them out of order, you'll know a little bit more than you should about some things that happened beforehand. But what changes, what keeps the series tied together is that emotional arc of the main characters. And that it also ties in really strongly with the romance. People who read the first one and thought that it was going to have a happily ever after we're like, wait, this is not a romance. They haven't resolved their relationship status. That's because that arcs over the series. So that's the main thing with series for me, is individual action plots resolve, but what the characters are going through as individuals, that keeps going.
So it's like life. The suspense plot resolves itself, but the emotional thing that we're all on a journey on is going to be a lifetime thing for everybody. And those demons continue with most of you guys' series, as it sounds in. Okay. For our non-series writers, going to ask the question, when you write suspense, do you like to knock the reader over the head with some big explosive revelation, or do you like to slowly sneak up on them and surprise them? Virginia, I'll start with you.
Both, any and all the things, check all the boxes. In Consecrated Ground, I have a lot of unanswered questions that weave throughout the story. And in No Shelter for the Stars, I got a big whopper right about halfway through. Actually, there's a whopper in Consecrated Ground as well. So it depends. It depends on what the story requires. I need to get a shirt that says that. You can't put depends on a shirt. It's not good. So I would say both, often both, because ultimately I want the reader to feel satisfied, right? And satisfied enough that they're like, oh, okay, I saw this coming, but I didn't see that coming. And I want to create that moment. But there's also these little beats of unanswered questions that you have to move the story along. So check all the boxes.
Okay, what about you, Riley?
I would say I've done both as well. And it does kind of, echoing what Virginia said, it does depend on the situation. That said, for romance, since in a romance, you really want your reader to care about your characters. You want them to be invested enough to root for your characters and to want that happy ending. And so much like when we get to know people, it's a gradual unwinding of this suspense, of this tension. A lot of mine does tend to be very gradual and sneak up on you, but I have had the big bombshell moments too, but those are a lot less frequent for me.
Okay, I'm going to flip over and I'm going to ask a few of the readers' questions right now before I jump into some more of my own. First question we have is to Elle. Where did you come up with the idea for Nearly Departed series?
I live in Festivity. So I live in the town where the series is initially set. There is a lake not very far from where I'm currently sitting, because I'm at my spouse's school right now, that a lot of cars have inadvertently gone into, and unfortunately the people in them did not come out of them. The town didn't even know it was happening for quite a number of years until somebody saw the tire tracks leading into the lake. And they did everything they could to try to stop that from happening. They reduced the speed limit, put up spotlights, a wall, and cars are still, even the week that the first Nearly Departed book released, a car hit the curb and launched itself over a 6-foot wall. And nobody understands really why all of these cars are ending up in there. And I came up with a paranormal explanation for why this might be occurring. Changed the name of the town because it's not really Festivity, but you can guess. If you are from the Central Florida area, you can guess exactly where I am. We have a town psychic, very famous nationwide town psychic. So I borrowed from that, made that one of the main characters. They were building the apartments next to the lake at the time. I'm like, oh, a construction worker on those apartments would be perfect to pair with the town psychic, someone who's very down to earth and someone who's very not. Let's see if they could possibly find some common ground and fall in love with each other.
Okay, you just made another question come to my mind for everybody else. Does any of the rest of you guys pull stuff like that from real life to throw into your stories? Riley's shaking her head. What do you use?
Influences from different places in the towns I've lived in or visited, different attributes or quirks that I may notice. I people watch a lot. So sometimes you just see something happening and you're like, yeah, why are they doing that? And then really unraveling that and putting it to paper. Yeah, absolutely. I pull from everything around me. And if you ask
never
my wife,
do anything in front of a writer.
Yeah, if you ask my wife, sometimes I pull from our relationship as well. So
I do that too. I tend to pull from true crimes that have happened, and like I start to build with a piece of that crime and then manipulate it and cut it the way that I need it to be cut. In Whereabouts Unknown, there is a young teen who is in a storage unit and kept in a storage unit. And I think it's been about 5 years ago now in South Carolina, there was a man who his goal was to keep a couple in a storage unit on his property in a rural area. Didn't quite turn out that way, but that's where I pull. And all of the heart of the crimes that I have in my books come from something that's real. And then I start to add and shape it to what I need it to be.
What about you, Virginia?
I don't think it's a good idea for me to expose just how superstitious I am about crows. Also, I'm extra nervous because wrong shoulder. This cover was designed by Anne McMahon, who is in the room, and just asked a question. How did you make the metaphor of the crow help drive the story in Consecrated Ground? That's a really long question. My check is in the mail. That's a really long one. I will say that there's a lot of crows in my neighborhood, and every day there's like this time where the crows that are off doing whatever congregate, they get together. And I had decided that was a town meeting. And then in Portland, if you look it up, there are thousands of crows that at sunset fly downtown. And it just sparks something in my imagination. And it's only a part of the story. The story is not necessarily about the crows, but it's a key element. And I wrote the story. And when Anne McMahon came back with this cover, I was gobsmacked because it just spoke directly to that. So crows drove me crazy. Added to the story.
And MB, what about you?
Yeah, I think in real life, I'm a little bit like a crow, but with little bits and pieces of things that I observe, things that people say, stuff that people do, things I read in the news, and also the sparks of ideas. Like I was in Sitka, Alaska, a dozen years before I wrote Running Off Radar, the second Maji novel, which takes place in Sitka, which I put in Sitka, of course, because I had this idea there. I was on a boat. We were doing a nature tour. They were talking about the intercontinental cables and how they were sunk with lead weights. And I even way back then, I thought, oh, that would be a really great place to hide something. You just attach it to the cable. And so in the book later, I think, whoa, what if my bad guys hid bars of gold down there? Because they look a lot like lead weights and they're really heavy. That would work. And that kicked off the whole story.
Okay. Have another reader question here, and don't forget, or a listener question, don't forget to put it in the Q&A because I'm not talented enough to read all the 70 chats and talk to everybody. So make sure to put it into the Q&A. Let's see. When you're writing a suspense mystery, how do you personally balance leaving the perfect amount of clues for readers without giving away the twist? Do you rely heavily on beta readers for their feedback for this? So how do you balance not being like, oh God, I saw that coming from a mile away, to, oh, you didn't give us any foreshadowing, you can't pull that off. So how do you balance that? I'll start with Meredith.
Oh my gosh, this is so hard. This is what I struggle with the most, I think. It actually is trying to figure out exactly, have I given any clue that this could possibly happen? Because the person who wrote the question is exactly right. Coming completely out of the blue is not good. But then also too, having way too many clues is not good either. And so one thing that I've found is that if I give a clue early on, but don't really come back to it for quite a few chapters, people tend to, their focus shifts into whatever else I'm having them pay attention to. And so when you bring that up later, it's like they can go, oh yeah, I forgot that happened in chapter 2. So that's one of the tricks that I use, but it's such a fine line and it's really difficult to do. And I think that's part of the reason why it takes me so long to write these books, is because I'm constantly doing that. But I also do have, I have a couple of people who really love mystery in my life, and they read it, and I ask them to read it specifically for that, so that I can gauge from them if it's coming as a good surprise or an interesting surprise, or, oh, that's just not right. So that they're very helpful for that, for me.
Okay, what about you, Riley?
I would say that I try to put everything in there, and as it's coming out to me, making sure that it's been at least alluded to somehow in the story with those breadcrumbs, with that foreshadowing, maybe with a little bit of backstory. But when I get to the end, after I've finished my first draft, I will always set it aside for a week and then go do a read through where I am just reading. I am not editing. I may make some notes on another page, but I need to know if I've actually brought the reader to where they need to know, or if I've kept some of this up in my head and they have no clue what's about to smack them. I will go through and I will try to take fresh eyes as a reader myself to figure out where those holes might be, that they're not, that this is just coming out of left field for them. So that's how I do the balance, is I try to take on the reader role and make sure that they're understanding enough to keep them engaged to get them going through.
Elle, what about you?
So this question makes me laugh a little bit because I did actually write one book that I would consider to be a murder mystery. It's sci-fi murder mystery romance, but it's got a mystery at the core of it. It's real to real love, and it's a standalone. And I think the way that I might have managed to not make it obvious is because I had absolutely no freaking clue who the murderer was when I got to the end of this book myself. And so it was, the irony is it was the one and only time I tried to actually plot a book from beginning to end. And I had plotted it out chapter by chapter, except for the last 5 chapters of this book, because I had no idea who the murderer actually was. And thank goodness my subconscious brain did know and had left when we started. I brainstormed with a writing group I was part of at the time. And we discovered, piecing it apart, that I had actually laid hints that consciously I wasn't aware of, but subconsciously, I guess I knew I had to have a killer in there somewhere. And so we were able to tie it up. But I think that probably kept it from being too obvious in the fact that the writer herself absolutely had no idea.
MB, what about you?
I will answer that, but first I'm going to say real to real love is really good, and I won't give a spoiler because who did it? Who the murderer is not the biggest surprise. It works. The ending works. You tie it up fine. But the biggest surprise is elsewhere buried in the story, and that's the part that I really love about that story. But for me, I usually know how things end, so that doesn't surprise me. And by the time I've gotten all the way through the book and rewritten it a couple times for myself and set it aside, I can no longer tell if the twists are surprising or not, because I'm just like, I don't know. I saw it coming because I wrote it and I reworked it and I reworked it, and I still knew it was there. It doesn't surprise me on the reread. So I do have to use beta readers at that point to say, if you hadn't spent 6 months reworking this, would you think this was surprising? So I definitely use them for that. And also character congruity. Is this what the characters would really do? Is it believable? Because that's part of landing a good surprise, is you think, I didn't see that coming, but it makes sense. Because I got to know these people, and yes, I'm so glad they did that. Or, oh, that was a really bad mistake, but I'm not surprised they would make that mistake.
And Virginia, what about you?
I don't trust myself to make those decisions. While I'm writing a story, I've got voices talking to me 24 hours a day. So everything is suspect. But I am very blessed to have, I don't even know if I can call her a beta reader, because she's the alpha reader. She gets, when I'm writing in Nano, she gets the dailies. And if she's on the call, you know who you are. I cannot appreciate you enough. I must send more whiskey. So she gets the dailies during Nano. When I'm working on a story and I'm trying to figure out if I'm hitting my mark, I'll send pieces or I'll send drafts and say, okay, how's the pacing? Are the questions being set up and answered at the right times? And I have hot or not checks, which I'll just send off a sex scene and go, look, does it turn you on or not? Because if it doesn't, I got to fix it. So that validation of, particularly for the suspense beats of, okay, how the pieces that I'm revealing, is this enticing you or is this pissing you off? That's really important.
Okay, since the question was about the perfect balance, I'm going to ask one of my own questions. Going back to that perfect, what do you think is the most perfect suspense book you've ever written? It doesn't have to be sapphic, or ever read, and it doesn't have to be sapphic. Which book is that book that you said, oh my gosh, I wish I wrote it. It is perfect. I'll start with Riley.
I would say anything by Jodi Picoult. It's not sapphic, but she does this really wonderful job of giving you this intricate story where you learn so much and get invested in these characters. And she's always surprising me up to the last several pages.
Okay. MB.
Well, outside of sapphic, and actually not entirely because of the Kate Martinelli series, I really love the way that Laurie R. King works suspense in all of her books. She's got standalone thrillers and the long Mary Russell series and the Kate Martinellis. And in almost all of those, she's got stuff where I get to about 2/3 through and I go, oh my God, I didn't see that coming. I love that. Now what's going to happen? So I really admire her craft. And of course, she's been writing for, like 40 years. So she is a master at that. I will say that when I read Threadbare, not to make Elle blush too much here, that weaving of the 2 point of views and one of them going forwards in time and the other one going backwards in time and the way that they intersected, it really built the suspense because one character knew more than the other character, but you as the reader didn't know the whole piece until those pieces came together. And I love that because I felt like I was being strung along in the best way.
Thanks.
And I could name a couple more. This Is How We Lose the Time War does a weaving like that, but it's a really different story. And Nicola Griffith did that kind of dual storyline weaving in the third Aud Torvingen book called Always, where she's got what happened before what's happening in the main story interspersed with what's happening in the main story. And you don't know, it feels like they're just on parallel tracks. You're just reading 2 stories until very close to the end. And then you're like, oh, that's how they're connected. Wow. I love the ones that go by the end, you're going, wow. That's why you did all that hard work. Cool. Good on you. I've never done one that's that much work.
What about you, Virginia?
First of all, I want to shout out to NB for reminding me about that Griffith series. I don't think I read the third one. I need to
it's the best.
So I read a lot, and it's very difficult for me to determine what is the biggest surprise in or most successful suspense in any particular story. But I will say that I recently read Victor Laval's latest book. I think it's his first novel, but I'm not sure. And it's called Lone Women. And from the very first page, whatever I thought was going on in this book was not the whole story. But not once did I feel as if anything was out of place or if it was dragged out or that something was held back. He seemed to anticipate when my brain was going to form a question about the story and then deliver what I needed to keep turning pages and losing sleep. Absolutely a fantastic book. I managed to answer all of those questions. Oh my God, did he deliver? Outstanding and highly recommended.
Meredith, what about you?
I love horror. I love to read it. I love to watch it. And when I was thinking about this question and listening to what everyone was saying, one of the books that was my very first love, when it was probably the book that made me want to be a writer, was when I read It. And I think I was like in 8th grade when I can't remember. It was when I got a hold of it, we'd say that. And I really loved how, if you think about it, we go through that whole book without knowing what it is. We know it can shapeshift and we know it can be a clown and all these other things, but we don't actually know what it is. We just know that these kids and then later these adults have to actually kill it. And it's really only not until the last 75 pages that we learn that it is a spider. What? Not to blow that storyline, but
spoiler.
Yeah. And I'm going off of what Virginia was saying too, like the dual timelines in that really work incredibly well too. We've got the storyline of the children who are battling this thing that's living underground. And then we have the adults who come back to kill it for good. So that's what I think of when I think of really good suspense. But I could be biased just because it was the book that made me want to be a writer.
And Elle.
I think the biggest influences on my writing and my character development would be we're all in science fiction. So your Tanya Huff and your Elizabeth Moon and your Anne McCaffrey. I always wanted to create characters the way that Elizabeth Moon created them. A strong female character lead who's got some kind of trauma in her past, who's a great action heroine who falls in love with someone, except I wanted her to fall in love with another woman. And so I took everything I learned from those masters of science fiction action-oriented work and then tried to apply it to it with a sapphic feel to it. And so I would say that she's my biggest influence. I'm an Agatha Christie fan from way, way back, of course. Shauna McGuire did one called Sparrow Hill Road, which is a collection of short stories that as you're reading it, they're all very suspenseful. You're focusing on hauntings and ghosts and such, but you cannot figure out what they have to do with each other. They have to, that they've got to be intertwined in some way. And when you hit the end and you figure out how these seemingly completely disjointed stories actually tie together, that was some seriously well done, in my opinion, suspense, just how, and it works. It's one of those, oh, wow moments that I can't remember which of you was saying, but that just, this can't possibly work. And it did.
Okay, I've got a few more readers' questions here, so I'm going to probably skip it around and not ask everyone since we're starting to run lower on time. So I'm going to ask this one of Riley. How does action suspense, I'm going to ask Riley and Meredith this question, I think, since I got a combination of both. How does action suspense differ from emotional suspense? And I'll ask Riley to answer that first.
I don't write a ton of action suspense. I know that's more Meredith's MO there. But so I would say for emotional suspense, you don't necessarily have anything driving you forward aside from the characters, but you still have that tension and those tense moments and that suspense of how it's going to go. And you still have to give your reader a little bit of respite afterward and just like a little bit of emotional coming back down. But I don't think it doesn't necessarily have to be quite as, I don't know, it's not quite as everything's neatly buttoned up. Emotions are never neat. So it's a little bit messy is what I would say, what I perceive to be the difference. Meredith?
Yeah, I would say I try to do an equal amount of both of them, like emotional and then also plotting forward. And there tends to be a lot of movement when the character is trying to solve something. So they're moving in lots of different directions. And sometimes I find my characters getting bogged down doing research at computers and stuff like that. And I always try to think about how I can keep them moving. And it doesn't always mean that they're moving in the correct direction, that they're going to be able to solve this, that maybe they're headed towards something that's going to give them a sliver of the answer. But if they keep moving, but I also think what Riley said too about having to give them respite is really important. Just like we know from our own bodies, we can push pretty hard for a couple of days, but at some point we're going to crash. And so whether that's from an emotional blow or that's from a physical movement, like exertion type of a thing. And I think that a lot of times in thrillers, when the detective or whoever is trying to solve it, the private eye, whatever, they are just as emotionally invested in this case as they are physically invested. And so a crash comes for them. And I think that's why these books, or at least for me, it makes more sense for me to keep them in a tighter timeline so that they can push themselves physically, but there has to be some places for crashing too.
And I'm going to ask that made me think of something here. The readers need an emotional reprieve too.
Yes.
Do you build in some of those that like the reader can only take so much heart pounding action and then they're like, okay, I can't do this anymore. So do you try to build in those scenes to break that up?
Absolutely.
Everybody's nodding their head. I'm saying, thinking, yeah, that you have to slow that down, not just for your character, but for your reader as well then.
Yeah.
I'd even say that those places where you build in pauses are where you build the character and keep the reader invested in that character getting or not getting the outcome for that character. So without that, it becomes just do. And if there's no respite, you stop caring about the character. So you need those down. You need quiet moments to breathe.
Definitely good. I'm going to ask one for Virginia, MB, and Elle, and then I'm going to end with the last one for all five of you. I can't add. 5 of you. Yeah. Okay. This question says, how do you balance revealing details to readers and to characters themselves? For example, readers knowing about past trauma of a character before their partner does. How do you balance who knows what for? Obviously, the readers are going to know at the same time, but do you let the readers know before the partner reads, is the way I'm reading this, or another character? So Elle, I'll start with you.
I would say that I'll steal Virginia's answer of it depends. It's when I'm writing a single POV, then the character and the reader will figure it out pretty much at the same time. When I'm doing multiple POVs or dual POVs, I can absolutely reveal something to the reader well before the partner or the love interest figures it out, because the reader gets to look into the main character's head. So they're going to see it, but the partner may not figure it out until the main character finally comes to her senses and lets them in. So yeah, most of my books are multiple POV or at least dual POV. It's very rare that I will do a single POV for that reason.
Virginia, what about you?
I definitely, well, to add on to Elle's answer, I definitely reveal to the reader before I reveal to the other character, the opposite character. The additional challenge, however, is braiding, because you're braiding these strands, right? You want to reveal enough to keep the reader invested without revealing too much. And you want to reveal enough to get them, align them with this character, to have them care about this character without making it too obvious. And you want to set up all of these strands where you learn more about this character before this character learns that same information. But also at the same time, I don't want to spoon feed details to my reader, right? And this is a key point that Ray Spangler shared with me once. Respect the intelligence of your reader, right? So I want them at times, and I have to set these up. Other strands are setting up these details so that they can connect the dots themselves, and I don't need to expressly state it. So it's a fun dance, but it's back to how does that happen? It depends on the story and the characters.
And MB.
For the Maji stories, they're all third person. And part of the benefit of that is that I can show to the readers things about my characters that they need to know so that later when my characters do stuff, it's believable to them. And whether the other characters have seen it before then or not, the other characters can be surprised if they want, but the reader needs to go, oh, of course she did that because she's a total badass because we saw her do this before. And the other character may or may not know about that. They can be really surprised, and that's great. And it is a challenge for me right now writing Blur's Day's Revenge, because I think it's my first full-length first-person point of view book. And you're learning everything that the main character learns as she learns it. And you only know what she knows. And I think that works particularly well for amateur sleuth books, because you get to see somebody bumble if you're not getting invested in what a great skilled professional they are. You have to know them because you're in their head so much. But for the more traditional thrillers, I think third person works really well because you get to show the reader what you want them to know.
Okay. And I'm going to combine my last question with the audience's last questions. I'm going to put it all together here. And what I'm going to say is I want each of you guys to tell us where we can find you, where we can follow you, what book you recommend everyone should read of yours first. Where should we start with you guys? And the audience question is, what books or writers inspired you to become a writer? So there's a lot to pack into that, but I'm going to do it all at once since we're watching the time here. I'll start with Meredith.
All right. I am at meredithdoench.com, and I am also currently on Facebook and Instagram, and I just recently started a Threads account. But this is my latest book, Whereabouts Unknown. It came out last spring. And that is the book that I would suggest you start with. The Louise Hansen ones the first one came out in 2015, 2017, 2019. But this one stands alone, so I think it works pretty well for that. What was the other question? Sorry.
And who inspired you to be a writer? You already mentioned it already, so you've answered that one. But if you have anything else?
Horror really was the genre that really brought me into it. And at some point, then I realized I was writing about justice, and so I flipped over to reading a lot of mystery novels at that point and things like that. So, yes, that's me.
MB.
The first of the Majis has been out quite a long time. If you want to start where I started knowing the character. I would start with strictly need to know. And it gets followed by running off radar, which is my favorite, but it helps to read the first one first. But if you want to read the quickest ride in the Maji series and get to know Maji before she meets Rose, then I would start with Double Down. So you got choices.
And who influenced you?
Everybody.
Okay.
I started reading when I was around 4, and I liked all kinds of genres. And I guess what inspired me to write Sapphic, though, was that I had not found very much in the badass women in love and danger area. I was like, I've read all these ones where mostly guys are saving the world and saving the woman and that sort of stuff. And I was tired of it. And I really wanted like strong secondary female characters and more of a group dynamic. And I wanted something different. And that's why I ended up writing the first Maji.
Virginia.
In no particular order, folks want to find me, virginiablackwrites.com, but I'll tell you the truth, I spend most of my time on the socials, generally arguing with Elle about something or another. Let's see. This panel is sponsored by my publisher, so you all probably already know about my debut novel, Consecrated Ground. It's available now, just came out this year. It's on sale now until Tuesday. I think the code is in the chat. My next novel, No Shelter But the Stars, is coming in late January, early February. I'm going to echo what MB said. I was inspired to write by everybody, right? I've been reading voraciously for decades, but I will say that there are 2 authors that have an influence on me at the moment. One makes me want to quit, and the other one inspires me to be better. Anna Burke makes me want to quit. Every time I read one of her books, at some point during that novel, I think I'm done. There's nothing else that I can offer the world because Anna Burke is writing. And the writer who inspires me to be better, though, is Ted Chiang. I don't know if any of you have ever read Ted Chiang. Every word is weighed and measured, and it is absolutely magical.
Riley.
I'm not as I used to be. We're in the process of adopting kids, so I am not as I used to be. I apologize. But you can find me on Twitter, sometimes Facebook, Riley Scott. I also Arabella book, so all my stuff on their site. My latest is Take Your Shot. It's a YA. It's my favorites that I've written to date. So I recommend either starting there, or if you want the spicier adult romance, Page Pass is the one I always recommend as the starting. And to echo what everyone said here, I think that the entire library inspired me. Books were one of the few things that in my tiny little conservative town, I could find paths out. And so I just soaked up as I could, and they all inspired me to tell the stories that I wanted to tell, where I could see myself in them. Really, any and all.
And finally, Elle.
Okay, so it really just depends on what genre you're looking for, because I love to play in the genres. So if you're looking for science fiction, absolutely start with Threadbare. That will always be the book of my heart. If you're looking for paranormal, start with Dead Woman's Pond. My most recent book is Harsh Reality, which is a combination of paranormal and sci-fi, depending on how you look at it. And my greatest influences, again, are the grand dames of science fiction. Your Tanya Huff, your Anne McCaffrey, your Elizabeth Moon. I came late to sapphic fiction. Jenny Frame and Radcliffe and everybody else in this room absolutely influenced me. But yeah, those were the main ones. You can find me mostly on Twitter, actually, while it still hangs on to its life. That is where I do the most social interaction with anybody. I am on Facebook as well. I do have a website, but if you actually want to talk to me, I am on Twitter. And yes, it's now called X.
Okay, thank you guys all. You guys were great panelists. It was fun to hang out with all you, listen to everything you had to say and all the knowledge you had to share with our listeners. And thanks to the audience for being here, and GCLS for putting all of these things on. Appreciate everybody's time, and you know where to find all these great authors now, so look them up.
Thank you for
See you next
Moscow.
time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Rita.
Thank you.